I'm going to be discussing clothing in this video, and that might strike you as a little bit strange or odd that somebody who often goes on YouTube philosophizing on these various aspects of psychological and existential existence that pertain to often what I tend to communicate topics on learning and creating meaning, and often even some related videos to artistic experiences such as visual or musical thinking and even dramatic elements of thinking. And I've discussed even characterization and food and cooking in various ways, and now it seems I'm now going to be talking about clothes. So why am I talking about clothes? It seems kind of like something that we just have to do. We have to put on stuff every day so we don't shame ourselves in some sense. Often clothes is associated, when we think about the origins of clothes, often there's going to be like two maybe major ideas you might come up with near initially that seem intuitive, and that would be to one that's more pertaining to these moral and ethical concerns that have to do with shame, because if you're naked out in public, typically you'll get shamed for it, or people are going to look at you strange, and that's frowned upon, and that makes us typically feel bad unless you're some individual who has shame resistance, and who has a very strong sense of self and can go out in public and wear funny stuff and or even be naked and be totally fine in public, comfortable in your own skin, but or sometimes mentally ill, because sometimes that's actually associated with psychiatric illness, rather than the opposite, high psychological sustainability, which tends to be people who tend to be more effective communicators rather than people who are less effective at communicating and articulating themselves, and they typically have a lower range of vocabulary, and that's a sign of also being more rigid and less cognitively flexible. But another theory that you might be familiar with, because you probably haven't actually engaged in the theorizing process, would be to regulate temperature, or having this sort of internal thermostat that we can better modulate. Modulate is a form of regulation, but it's more complicated than that. Modulations have to do with being able to toggle and configure different multifunctions within a set of multifunctionalities that can happen to a particular subset of function, in which we can say, smartphones are a good example of this, because they can even turn on your lights, they can play music randomly in your home, open your garage door, they can do all these kind of different things, and they have these multifunctionalities to them, right? But we can hone into certain different presets too that allow us to toggle between different configurations, say, of lighting. Toggling allows us to be able to select a very different arrays of options, but also engage in various subtle forms of calibration. It's not the same thing as a calibration process, but is associated with that. And they're often all interconnected in some manner. And these connectives of communicative, meaningful information, cause and effect relationships that we can operate through are subjectivo-objectivo relationships that are developed through a masterful self-knowledge that allow us to increase the mobility of meaningful perception, action, and behavior apparatuses in association with meaningful perception, action, and behaviors. So that goes back to this calibration between the, say, mind's hand and mind's eye and mind's tongue, in being able to communicate with our vocal cords and tongue, various speech in association with our hand-eye coordinations and movements that allow us to navigate the world, not just mentally or psychologically in regards to our mentalizations, our representative categories that we move through and deepen through categorization processes as we develop greater masterful self-knowledge, that we can increase our agency in capacities to be able to do different things, right? Put different things together. and come up with different things in innovative ways that allow us to better navigate the environment and increase our environmental mastery, which is actually a major component of psychological well-being. It's being able to create meaning, that's one separate dimension, and then also environmental mastery. And part of how we can create meaning is that calibratory process that connects those mental representative organs of the mind, those mental organs of the mind, with our direct objective tethered to the world that comes from the self and surrounds in proximity, near and far, the external surrounding that's around us and encompasses us, and that has these immaterial and material substances to them that are more solid, you could say, and that we can tap on, and it'll make a noise, and make noise more reliably and consistently. And it has more objectivity because it comes back to these centralities of meaning that are predominantly easier to access because it has that objectivity, and objectivity helps us to create easier access. So when you say take a note, or you well define something, right? Say that you've tasted a nice juicy hamburger that you created yourself from a homemade recipe that you only came up with had you engaged in a exploratory process of combinatory ingredients from prior experiences. You really, really, really liked the taste of paprika and olive oil, and you decided, well, I don't know too many burgers that really combine olive oil and paprika, so I'm going to throw some olive oil, paprika, some salts, and I really like garlic. I'm just going to kind of toss some garlic powder in there, and maybe just a splash of cream just to give it some sort of additional fats, because I really, really I noticed like when I created some burgers and I was just cooking some burgers from the box, that when I throw it on the barbecue, there's all these fats that come up, and when I tasted that, it was just so much more juicier and beefier, and I enjoyed it so much more. It was so much more savory, flavory. And so you decide, okay, maybe if I put cream, it'll do something similar because it looks kind of similar, right? And if it's beef and dairy comes from cows, maybe there's something going on here. Maybe. We don't know. So we're getting in this creative process, and we take all that grounded up meat with our salt and our paprika, a little bit of olive oil, a little bit of cream, and we start smashing it up together, and then we get these beef patties, and at the end of it, we kind of look at it, and it's like, okay, maybe I'll just put a topping of some black pepper, just a little bit of black pepper, not too much, and I'll start to put some vinegar on my grill to get rid of all that debris, because I know vinegar is great at breaking down things. It's often used for cleaning, but also if I use vinegar, say, as just instead of just like scraping my grill, maybe some of that taste will also be on the grill. So when I put my burger on there, it'll have some additional flavor. And so you engage in that process, and what you've done is you've helped to take these subjective thoughts and to bring them into the world, and now you're engaged in a creative process, but you haven't necessarily well defined them and made them more objective until you've actually eaten that burger, reflected on it, and written a recipe. When you start writing that recipe and you hone in on those notes from those flavors that we conceptualize as different flavorings, and that we can savor and well defined in regards to how we would go about meaning interpreting them, we can tap into these aesthetic experiences through symbolization that allow us to take these, which is different, mental notes of those notes from taste and perception that pertain to food. And these are different, they're categorically different rather than category different. That's very shallow in processing. They're more deepening our categoricals of knowledge and involve a categorization process rather than a categorizing process. And they're distinct in meaningful ways WEIGHS, in regards to how we go about accessing that meaning. And in near and far direct perceptions, we can be able to tap into different toggles of meaningful interpretation. The more creative we engage in things, and the more we can codify complex sets of meaningful information in efficient manners, such as writing a recipe from after we engaged in a particular experience. And you find some of the most sophisticated and advanced creative and intellectual ideas of great thinkers who've thought great and who have come up with great ideas had journals. And they often wrote on matters of their direct perception, reflecting on prior experiences, but often also thinking about what's current to experience and taking note of that and creating a manner of establishing well-defined subjective-objective relationships, in which subjectivo-objectivo relationships that pertain in regard to specific cause and effect relationships are instantiated in direct perceptions that become more accessible. And eventually, over time, what really makes them great is that people start to resonate with that and substantiate those processes. It gets replicated, it gets selected in this evolutionary dynamic in which semantic processes and behaviors are being opted for more and more, because that subjective experience that's associated with those meaningful emotions is modeling something of deepening interest and value and worth and worthwhileness in particular. And that creates a sense of meaning, but not just a sense of meaning, meaningful living. And that tends to be what has built skyscrapers and cityscapes, was these aesthetic priors with properties that allow us to hone in on those meaningful subjectivo-objectivo relationships that help us to navigate perception, action, and behavior meaningfully, and conduct ourselves in a manner that allow us to be able to engage in a modeling process of meaningful information that is not just meaningful, but it's what deepens meaningfulness processes. And clothing is something that tends to deepen meaningfulness processes, not so much in how it regulates, say, body temperature, or can reduce the frequency of experiencing negative emotions associated with more social related perception, action, and behavior, but which can also be a manner of expressing ourselves and embodying our future selves before we even get to our future selves in the current moments of experience, and which can allow us to also be able to learn how to take ourselves less seriously and become more mature in being able to be comfortable in our own skins, quite literally by wearing something over our skins that allow us to feel better, allow us to feel more authentic and more true to who we are. And one thing that really makes this, I think about Halloween when you're wearing a costume at Halloween, or if you've ever went to an anime convention or comic book convention and you saw people cosplaying, or you cosplayed yourself. This tends to be a very positive thing. People tend to be more friendly and approachable because there's a manner of which we can take ourselves less seriously and engage and humor ourselves more, and also engage in this more imaginal world of existence that is creatively bound and taps into those meaningful emotions. And the creations of meaning, quite literally, because especially when it comes to cosplay is something that people often create themselves, and they're engaging in those subjective-objective dynamics that subjectivo-objectivo relationships are forged through direct perception and meaningful navigations of that, engaging in a meaningfulness process that is very similar to those festive sort of emotions that you experience at, especially in childhood, most sentimentally, when it comes to holidays upcoming with Halloween or Christmas, maybe even Easter, in which there are these imaginal elements that are brought to life in the near and far self and surrounds near most to the external surrounding environment that encompasses us. And you'll see this because we start to not just engage in various different festive clothing and maybe even eat different festive foods, but sometimes even decorate things. And we're, in a way, giving the walls and different things clothing. And that allows us to tap into these sentimental, meaningful emotions that have a value to them that is temporaneous, and which tends to be what can also create meaningful living and tap more into a meaningfulness process. And even when it comes to, say, improv or theater, using props or sometimes even just wearing a costume can allow us to expand our range of meaningful emotion and even become more effective communicators who have a deeper sense of self and can develop a more masterful sense of self-intelligence in that process, only insofar as we're actually willing to then subsequently formalize that, much as the great thinkers have in taking note and journaling. And journaling is very similar in terms of its etymology, in terms of its word history and development and semantic evolution, to journeying. And there's very little difference actually when it comes to taking that pencil to a page and writing the direct perceptions of your conscious experience and actually going on a journey, an imaginal journey. Even, I think, anybody at any age can, so as long as they can really walk and they can be comfortable in their own skin enough to be able to sometimes even do that on their own and engage in a solitary practice in which they can experience solitude on these journeys, in which you can, say, take a forest trail and not just, say, go on the common tread path, but look at something that calls out to you and to investigate some aspect of the environment that you wouldn't otherwise, and which complexifies your world by engaging in the aesthetics of the surrounds that are directly connected to the meaning of affects that you're creating in a real-time experience. And the clothing we wear helps us to engage in various forms of self-expression that allow us to do a similar process of journeying, that we could be our own heroes and can start to cosplay the animated characters of our consciousness and these characterizations that come to life. And that's all I wanted to say for this video. I hope you enjoyed. Bye.